that's associated with depression. Suicide. Suicide is not a mental disorder, however, but it's associated with depression as well as with other disorders. With suicide, when students adolescent gets to a point, or anyone gets to a point where they feel like I'm feeling a certain way, I can't put my finger on it, and I don't like the way I'm feeling, I have no interest in anything, as though life may be at a standstill for them. And sometimes they may think that suicide is the answer. So that's one of the things that parents need to be aware of, is suicide as well, in reference to depression. And correlation with the suicide rate and depression rate, there's a high correlation. So if depression is evident or noticed, then some question for suicide should be asked. Some of the signs of possible suicide could be, like I mentioned before, a lack of interest in certain things. And sometimes that might be an issue when there's a failed relationship with someone and the person talks about actual wanting to end their lives. When they talk about wanting to end their life, it's not a joke. Even though, this is not the behavior of the particular adolescent that you're familiar with, or your child. This is not their normal behavior. So therefore, if they mention suicide, then that's an opportunity to talk about it. The fear of talking about suicide is not going to cause a person to talk about it, to actually commit the act. So if you would just maybe confront your child about it, or the adolescent you're in contact with about it, and it's okay. And another concern is if the person has an actual plan for the suicide, that's even more of a concern. So if that's the case, and it's advisable to seek mental health assistance with that. Another disorder that I would like to talk about, and that's anxiety. Anxiety disorder is one that's the second leading one in reference to adolescents. And sometimes you'll see that they kind of go hand in hand, anxiety and depression. With anxiety, some of the possible signs of anxiety is when an adolescent is feeling anxious in any way. They feel like sometimes they're very irritable, and they have excessive fear or worry, unnecessary fear about different things. Maybe things that they weren't afraid of or feared in the past. And it could be simple things, like for instance, if a person in the past was not afraid of lightning and thunder, and all of a sudden they're afraid of lightning and thunder, or if they weren't afraid to be left alone and all of a sudden they don't like to be left alone, they can't stay alone by themselves. Anything is, in some cases, irrational beliefs about things. And if you notice this about some adolescent which you work with, or your children, then that's a sign for you, an opportunity for you to ask other questions to find out what occurred to cause this anxiety. And all of us are anxious to some degree about different things when we're stressed, but this is beyond the average to the point that it interferes with the functioning level. Going back to mental health, like I said, when you're able to deal with whatever comes before you, and you can deal with it and move on and stay in the norm. Again, like with anxiety, if there's a problem, it's more than that norm. It's so intense that a person functioning level has been interrupted, and they can no longer function at the normal level that they've been previous level they've been functioning on. Some other things that might be an issue: a surge of overwhelming panic. If all of a sudden you notice that your adolescent or your student has an overwhelming fear or panic all of a sudden, then that's an area for concern as far as anxiety disorders. But that's something that students have, that we have to deal with when we're working with students. So these are just some of the signs that I would like for the parents and those who work with adolescents to recognize. And once they recognize it, and some of the things that they can do and actually move on to another step. And if they need to get assistance through some of the facilities that we're going to highlight at the end of our program, then you would know where you can go in order to get these students assistance, or these adolescents some assistance. Another thing is feeling out of control. Even sometimes adolescents might verbalize, I'm feeling out of control. I don't know what I can do anymore. I don't know how to handle things anymore. Sometimes they verbalize and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it comes out in their action, their inability to do certain things. So if you're aware of all the actions of your students or your adolescents, then that'll help you to help them maintain appropriate mental health. One other area is substance abuse. One of the, I mentioned 3 areas that I would be interested in talking to you about, and the other is substance abuse. With substance abuse, some people think that it's very obvious. And some of the signs that a lot of people who work with adolescents and students, or even your own child, you can tell that something is different again. But when it comes to substance abuse, some of the things that you might notice that might have changed with your student could be cycles of increased energy or decreased energy level, because sometimes with certain drugs, what happens is it increases the activity level, or sometimes it reduces the activity level of the students. So those are just some of the things, just increase or change in activity level. And I see that we're running out of time, but here's some assessing ways that I would like for you, ways that parents can use to assess what's going on with the students that you work, or students, positive indicators, and as well-being and resiliency. Get that out. Sorry about that. But what it is continue to communicate with the students that you work with. Communicate with these adolescents. Ask them, okay, how are you doing? How are you functioning? How are you doing? Are you doing well in school? How are your grades? Are your grades dropping, or are they increasing? But if there's a decrease, if there's a problem, you need to know that by continuing to talk to the students. Another thing that you do, broad questions of measured symptoms of well-being of emotional distress. You can talk to them and say, how are you doing as far as dealing with stress in your life? How are you dealing with the stress that's coming your way? And they can say, well, I've done this. When was the last time you experienced some type of stress that seemed overwhelming? They can tell you what it is, and then you can assess whether or not they come up with some possible, really reasonable ways of dealing with those issues. Another way to assess the mental health status of the adolescents, form of assessment technique, meaning that you can actually go to a mental health professional and get the mental health professional to actually assess with the various tools that they have in order to assess whether or not your child is experiencing some type of mental illness or mental difficulties. One other thing, data about receipt of services for mental health related problems. If you are concerned that might be a possibility that the adolescent is experiencing some type of mental difficulties, you can actually research the information. And information is readily available through mental health professionals and also on the web. You can assess the web. If you think they're having certain problems, you can actually include that information in a search engine, and then it would come up whether or not that could be related to some type of mental illness. Some of the things that parents, essential things that they need to do. Parents need to keep communication open all the times with their children. Whenever you're working with them, always keep talking. If you keep talking, they have an open relationship with the parent or your adolescent, then they will feel comfortable coming to you to discuss anything that they see as being a problem. If it's a relationship issue, then they can come and talk to you before it gets to a point where it's unbearable and maybe can end in